novelist of empire. He glorified the British Empire and expansion, the white man's burden, bringing civilization to heathen Africa, bringing civilization to India, civilization, Christianity, all those good things. That's what he sees, and he wrote a number of novels. And there are some old movies that are still around, worth showing, worth getting and looking at, like Jungle Book, things like that. Gunga Din, which was about the British in India. Glorifying the empire. So, on the one hand, you have Dickens, who is looking at London as a disaster, and the Great Industrial Revolution creating social disaster in England. And then on the other hand, Kipling is looking at the empire and all its glories. So you sort of have to kind of ferret out what is really true. Well, they're both true, and it's a strange contradiction. We're going to talk about empire a little bit today, but what I want to first mention going in here, I'm going to talk about empire in relation to how it impacts, don't write this down, but how it impacts some of the major issues heading toward the First World War. Because empire is going to play a major factor in that. What I want to do right now is just take a little bit of an overview on the 19th century generally, and then move into specific issues dealing with Britain in the 19th century, and then hopefully just maybe get into starting some of the causes of the First World War, because I'd like to talk about that definitely next week, and get us up to some place that you can kind of relate to in terms of terminology. In the 19th century, like I said, there are no major wars. And Britain is leading everybody in terms of the Industrial Revolution. It's the only country that's gone through it so far. But at the same time, you have the leftover vestigial remnants of the pressure toward national movements. The revival of this really, as they used to call it in the 19th century, the pestiferous virus of nationalism. Why was everybody looked at it with such a jaundiced view? Is because that was the French Revolution. That produced the concept of the nation that was so violent and so roughly overthrew so much of Europe's status quo. It was the great poison ideology of the late 18th and early 19th century. And the job of the concert of Europe was to put it down, make sure it never happened again. Well, they failed both. They failed to put it down and failed to stop it from happening again. You have three revolutionary waves occur in the 19th century. And first of all, the revolutions of 1820s. You have revolutions in Italy, revolutions in France, you have revolutions in Greece, all occurring in 1820 to try and generate some kind of a national entity. The only one that was successful were the Greeks. Okay, we talked about the Greek Civil War, we talked about the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks will emerge as an autonomous province in the Ottoman Empire, but it's still a very firm little germ of nationalism. It violates the European concert. So the British will put a good I'd say, a good in on a questionable deed by bringing in a legitimate monarch to become king of this Greek nation. And that the kingship will last until 1969, when the Greeks overthrew their monarchy and established a republic. So that one's successful, the other ones are not. 1830 is another round of revolutions. The one we talked about was the one when the Belgians became separate from Holland to proclaim their own nation state, to have their own, what we call it, their own place in the sun at some point. And Britain interfered with that and helped bring Belgium about, create Belgium, because they had economic ties to the Belgians. They were outsourcing a lot of their machinery and some of their production to Belgium because it was cheaper to do it, just like we do it today with China, only without the same results. But the same, my toaster doesn't work again. Third toaster. I'm just ready to light the oven, throw the toast in.
I'm an electrician before the house catches on fire.
Well, I know I threw away toaster number 3, and now I'm in trash. It doesn't matter which brand, they all stink.
They're all big.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just my thoughts about some of this stuff. I'm stuck going to Weimar to buy things because it's close. You know, I don't want to go over to Costco to have to make a move. If I go to Weimar, it's all made in China. All made in China. Everything. I think except dog food. That's me. Dogs. Whatever, kidding around. The revolutionary movements, 1830s, Belgium is successful, other ones are not. And then you have the big revolutions of 1848. It impacts almost all of Europe. There's an Italian revolution to try and bring about an Italian nation. There had not been an Italian nation since the end of the Roman Empire. And if you look at a map of the mid-19th century, there still wasn't. What you have is Italy divided up into 12 separate states, controlled by the Austrians, controlled by the church, controlled by Spain. It's a total jigsaw puzzle. The other country that had the same problem in 1848, trying to come together as a unified nation, were the German states, known as the German Confederation. And that was a disaster. They were trying to bring about form a German nation. People that spoke the same language, and same culture, same geographical background and so forth, trying to proclaim a German. And the country that stood against that, oddly enough, was Prussia. The Prussians said, no, if we do that, we're going to invite the interference of everybody else in Europe. Nobody wanted to unify Germany. Eventually it's going to come. And then you have a revolution in Russia. Again, you had one in 1825 called the Decembrist movement, 1825, and again in 1848. Bring about reforms. Bring about a greater constitutional guarantees in Russia. Always a problem. And then finally free the serfs. Spell that correctly, okay?
With an E?
No, a U.
Serfs up. Not that kind, okay? Meaning the people who were bound to the land. Couldn't move, been this way has been developing for about 6 centuries after the Mongol invasions. And they freed the serfs in the same year that Lincoln gave the emancipated the slaves. 1863, the speech that did that. So we're just about even on some of this stuff. That same czar was assassinated. That was Tsar Alexander II. To be followed by a very repressive czar named Alexander III. So all these things are going on, and It's nationalism, it's reform within the country, people wanting to bring about constitutional reforms. There's a lot of this kind of stuff. Now it's hard, and it's very, I mean, you have to really read it carefully, and I must say, you go through it, you get, I think probably if you get interested in it, you're okay. If you don't, it's just always gonna look like some kind of a bad jigsaw puzzle in the 19th century. Other things going on. You have international tension apart from these revolutions. The international community was able to go to the rescue and stop some of these nationalist movements during the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Various international components did this out of the concert of Europe. How much longer would it last? And then you begin to have the big splits themselves that occur among the major powers. So what are the major powers of the 19th century? You have 5 major powers. Anybody?
Austria, Great Britain, France, and Russia, and Prussia.
Right? Right.
Well, what about in the Ottoman Empire at this time?
The Ottoman Empire is there, and that's a big question. It's the other. And it's a big question for the Europeans because they never are quite sure how to deal with the Ottoman Empire. Why? Because it's in southeastern Europe, and it's Muslim. And do you, and the concert of Europe is primarily what? A Christian concert. And do they want to really reach out and say, well, let's bring in, the Ottomans into the system that might screw things up? But the fact that they don't do it, they do it and they don't do it. They're not sure what to do with it. It gives them headaches. Well, in the 19th century, the one country that really assures that the Ottomans are going to be included is Russia. Because Russia is constantly pushing up against the Ottoman Empire to constantly move westward to get the warm water port through the Black Sea. They want that. They need to have that. Russia has no ice-free ports, except several months out of the year you might, over in Kamchatka you might have an ice-free day. Certainly in the Baltic you're going to have maybe 3 months of the year you're going to be ice-free in the Baltic. But the other 9 months you're not going to be. What about the Arctic Ocean? Let's not discuss it. The Arctic, you have 2 port facilities, Murmansk and Archangel up there. They're caked in 10 months out of the year. So ice-free is very important. You have products, you have natural resources. Good things to sell to other countries. They want to do it. England's been its primary outlet through the Muscovy Company. But basically the Russians have a hard time because they have no way to export. Russian river systems go into the Caspian Sea, which goes nowhere. It's landlocked in South Asia, right, just north of Persia. And then you have the Black Sea, but that's hammered in by the Ottoman Empire. If you want to get to the Mediterranean, you've got to break through that into the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, into the Mediterranean, and then you have your ice-free port. Well, okay. The British have a sort of a stranglehold on Russia in terms of trade through the Muscovy Company. What they don't want to do, however, is see Russia overwhelm the Ottoman Empire. Why? Let me see if anybody else knows. I know you know. Right? And you better start writing that shit in your blue books. He comes here, he answers all the questions, he knows. But he's paralyzed with pen in hand. That's my point. But he's going to wear his kilt, so we can see him. And that's going to do what? That's going to take care of everything, all your sins.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, I mean, I just like to let him know that I know that he knows the stuff, and why don't you learn how to say it, would you please? Learn how to write it.
All right.
In English. Okay. He wants to use Gaelic.
Yep.
All right, so, in dealing with this whole thing, what is British foreign policy in regards to the Ottoman Empire? Since you're the one, raise your hand and tell us.
They want to protect the Ottoman Empire from falling apart because that protects India, which is the pride of the empire.
Okay, what does that mean?
So they have to stop the Russians from overrunning the Ottomans
Okay.
because they don't trust the Russians to protect their interests in the Middle East.
Take your pen down and write down something and underline that's called the Eastern Question. The big question of the 19th century in southeastern Europe is this clash between the British Empire and Russian expansionism.
Do you think we should keep all this in mind in terms of a frame of thought that the whole purpose of the concert of Europe till World War I is to keep checks and balances on each country, so.
Well, if they could keep that purpose in mind for a full century, which is unlikely they did, the concert of Europe was largely done in by the unification of Germany in 1870, Franco-Prussian War. That really ended the concert, pretty much. Although it's going to be called again, I don't think anybody remembers what the hell it's for. It's like, we call the United Nations to do something, and people say, United Nations. We know there's a club here on campus. Is that what we're talking about? Or is there really a United Nations that are doing anything? Nobody knows. Okay. But, yeah. Because they called it again in 1882. And it got together and they condemned the British. And, but again, at the same time, they didn't do anything about it. So it's probably interesting. So you have this issue with Russia moving to the southwest. And a war that shouldn't have happened. It's the mid-19th century crisis. You have two of these wars. Both involve the British. The first is the Crimean War. The second is the aftermath of the Crimean War, which sparks a revolution in British India and the coming of the Sepoy Mutiny. Have you ever heard of the Sepoy Mutiny? S-E-P-O-Y Mutiny. And so first of all, the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, fought in the Crimean Peninsula of the Black Sea. I mean, really in the middle of nowhere. This map, I don't think even shows the Crimean Peninsula. If you're looking for the Mediterranean, if you look for the little blue moving into Europe there, okay, that's the water. Black Sea here, and this little peninsula sticking out is the Crimean Peninsula. Now, strange things. What was this war about? This war is going to involve Britain, France, Russia, and eventually one of the Italian states, Piedmont, Sardinia, which you don't need to know, but it's another party that got involved. What caused it? The tension between expansionist Russia and the British trying to keep them at bay. And it starts like this. A doctrine was developed in the mid-19th century with a Latin name to it. It's called Civis, C-I-V-I-S, Civis Romanus Sum. Civis Romanus Sum. C-I-V-I-S, R-O-M-A-N-U-S, Sum, S-U-M. It means I am a Roman citizen. Now this is really far out. It comes from the New Testament, from the book of Acts, in the ancient, which was written during the early Roman imperial period. And it's when Paul was arrested in Jerusalem for preaching Christianity. He was arrested by Jewish authorities, turned over to the Romans. And when he was placed in a Roman prison in Jerusalem, he says, basically to the Roman authorities, what do you think you're doing? Civis Romanus Sum. I am a Roman citizen. all the guards could have been executed that arrested Paul that day. Because why? Because it's against the law to ever lay hands, a Roman soldier to ever lay hands on a Roman citizen. Roman citizenship was only granted to a very few people in the early empire. Later it was granted to everybody. But this is the first decade, the first century, and that was something that was very special. Paul's family had gained Roman citizenship. Nobody knows how that happened, but nonetheless he did. And so he said this, and everybody said, "Oh God." And he appealed to Caesar for his trial of his case. He actually appealed to Caesar. The problem is it was the wrong Caesar. Nero. No, you don't want to appeal to Nero. You got a problem, keep it yourself. Anyway, turns out Nero executed him. So much for being a Roman citizen. But, 19th century, something happened. In other words, he was appealing for his country's protection over him in Jerusalem. Protection of the Roman army, protection of the Roman political machine. And Caesar to protect him. I'm a Roman citizen, I have that right. Well, in the 19th century, and we're talking 19th centuries later, there was a Portuguese citizen who lived in the city of Athens, but he happened to have British citizenship as well, and he sold a lot of material. He was an exporter. He sold material in the city of Athens, but he also had outrageous prices and ripped a lot of people off, and they burned down his warehouse in Athens. So here he is. He's Portuguese, he's Jewish, and he's a citizen of England. He's a citizen of Britain. So when they burned down his warehouses, he screamed, "I am a British citizen. You can't screw with me like that." And the British government said, "Yeah. Reggie, have you ever had that before? Anybody yelling and screaming to our British citizens, and we have to come to their rescue? And, well, maybe we should. What do you think?" And Reggie thought about it. "Yeah, I think so. I think we need to make a statement here. After all, we have the Queen's honor to defend." So they did it. They decided to come, and they created this doctrine called Civis Romanus Sum. From the New Testament, the very words, and said this is now applicable, that citizens of Britain anywhere in the world are going to be protected by the government of Great Britain. Well, that's wonderful, because everybody said the same thing at the same time, because now the French came along and said, "Well, you can do it, we can do it." And the Russians were saying the same thing. So this is kind of how this little, so you begin to have this international clash over protecting of your citizens overseas. Next step. In the Holy Land, which was under the Ottoman Empire, meaning what is today Palestine, Israel, West Bank stuff, all of that area, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, you have what's called the holy sites. When we talk about Islam, we talk about the holy places. When you talk about Christianity, you talk about the holy sites, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, as opposed to the holy places, Mecca, Medina. It's all in the same region, but you've got to make sure you understand which is which. Okay, I mean, some of you have never been past Tijuana, so I know that this is going to be a lesson in something. Okay, now, never been past Talent. Well, actually, some people here have never been out of Ashland, ever. There's a curse that falls on people who leave Ashland. But you have to take your Birkenstocks with you. Okay. So, if you can feature this, in the city of Jerusalem, there was a huge church. Been there forever. Been there since the 3rd century. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. It's about a mile from the mosque. the Al-Aqsa, about a mile from there. Big building. And I call it Christian Disneyland because it's all divided up inside. You have areas of the church that are controlled by the Russian Orthodox Church, areas of the church that are controlled by French Catholics, areas of that church are controlled by the Anglican Church of England. You've got areas of that church that are controlled by Coptic Orthodox from Egypt. You have a lot of, I mean, everybody's divided, and this is then. This is the 19th century. Everybody's got a piece of the action. And it's really true. When I went there, I remember going inside that, and they are still there. The monks are still there. They're still there in every room with their hand out, taking their collection, you know. Over here is where Jesus was arrested inside this part of the building. Over here is where he is crucified. We have crucifixion taking place here. Over here to the left, we have where he's buried. And down here is where the empty tomb is located, where he rose. I said, you mean he did all this inside this church? I mean, what kind of, you know, I'm a Baptist. Man, I don't understand this stuff. But I just thought this was the most bizarre thing. It's not bizarre. This is the medieval world still with us in the 19th century, and these monks, various groups, all had control of these areas of the church. Well, over the years, up until 1853, there had been a collision between Russian Orthodox monks and the French, those little flimsy French Catholic monks inside the Church of the Seven. And the Russian guys just pushed those little French guys out of the way, took their keys, took over the whole. And so finally the French said, you know, I've had enough. I'm going to appeal to Caesar. I'm going to appeal to Napoleon. So they appealed to Napoleon III, who was the new ruler of France. He's the nephew of the great Napoleon. Became ruler of France in 1849. And he wants to flex his muscles, internationally, that is. So he says, okay, we got a problem. He warns the Ottoman Sultan. The poor Ottoman Empire, they can't win. So he warns the Ottoman Sultan, he says, get the keys back from the Russians and give it back to the French where it belongs. When the Tsar hears about this, this is now Nicholas I, hears about it, he says, wait a minute. No way. Get those keys back from the French and give it back to the Russians where it belongs. Otherwise, you're going to have a really bad day in Jerusalem. But he wasn't kidding about the bad day, but it wasn't in Jerusalem. Within a month, Russian forces had invaded the Ottoman Empire. Based on what? On civis Romanus sum. We're going to protect our monks, our interest at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by invading the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you don't think that's a stretch, okay, yeah.
So did the Ottomans back up the French claim?
The Ottomans tried to back up the French claim, but then they got themselves tangled up between the Russians and the French, and they're both threatening to invade the Ottoman Empire. I just love the Crimean War because it's so absolutely, totally surreal, okay, in every way.
Screwy.
Well, I mean, it just is. And that's not even the war. I mean, that's just how we got into the war. So now, the Brits step in. The British look at this thing and they go, oh my God, you know, what are we going to do? We've got a problem between the Russians and the French, and there's the Ottoman Empire. We want to preserve the Ottoman Empire. How do we handle this? Well, ultimately, the Ottomans are warned. Actually, I'm sorry, the Russians are warned to back out by the two autocratic empires at the time that operate like the Russians do. That's Austria and Prussia both said, look, don't get into this. back out. So they backed out. But yet we have a war. Why? They backed out. They returned to Russia. The troops backed out of the Danube Valley. They backed out of the Black Sea area. They began to pull out of an area known as Moravia, Bessarabia, which is right on the Black Sea coast. They're pulling out, they're going back. And then come the British. Lord Palmerston, who is Home Secretary, no, has nothing, he's not in charge of foreign affairs or anything else, but he's in the British cabinet as Home Secretary. And he looks at the situation, and he has a colleague stationed in Istanbul, a friend of his, and he's received a dispatch very timely dispatch that was actually stolen by the British diplomat in Tehran, Iran, which in those days was known as Persia. It was smuggled back to Britain. He read the document at a cabinet meeting. They read the document and it said this: Russia now proposes with Persia to invade British India. Russia now proposes with Persia that together they'll invade British India. How are they going to do it? Through Afghanistan. Now, Palmerston, just what, a generation earlier, had lost about 10,000 guys in Afghanistan in the first Afghan war, British-Afghan war, when they invaded from India. We haven't talked about that, but it's all right. So anything, invasion from Afghanistan into India by Russian and Persian forces, how dare you? So he urges the British ambassador at Constantinople, and he still calls it Constantinople. He says, you know what, the Russians are backing out of the war, but I think we need to keep the Russians in the war to do one thing. Let's teach them a lesson they'll never forget. So he's instigating a war now. That's why you can't trust the British. He's instigating a war. He tells his representative at Constantinople, his name is Canning, C-A-N-N-I-N-G, it's another Canning, there's several of them. Tells Canning, you tell the Ottoman Sultan that he needs to declare war on the Russians and attack the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. Just get them up, get them going. We can't let this war peter out before it starts. We are going to have a war. So the Ottoman Sultan sends the Ottoman fleet just off the coast of Sinope, S-I-N-O-P-E, Sinope is the southern port in the Black Sea, to attack the Russian fleet. The Russian fleet sinks the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Sinope, and 2 weeks later, Britain declares war on Russia for sinking the fleet. The French join with the British because they don't want to be left out. Why? This is Napoleon III. He wants a war too. He wants a little prestige. So everybody's embroiled and nobody knows why they're in this war. Well, you can spend easily a week on this war. I'm not going to do it. First year of the war, the British sent over about 50,000 troops. The French sent over just about the same. The British troops were in terrible shape. They were a very sickly group. They came from the big poverty pits. Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, London. Very poor, working class, very sickly. Terrible recruits. They were better at bar fights than they were at military drill. But they went over with leadership that also was very bad. The commander of the British forces in the Crimea, his last war was the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. This is now 1853. Just do the math. Guy's dead. Crippled. Okay. So everybody's, I mean, nobody knows what they're doing. They get to the Crimea, there's a huge storm, half the British fleet sinks. Supplies are lost. The French pull up to the north on the Crimean Peninsula, dig entrenchments, set up their latrines, set up their kitchen. They build a pretty good system up there. The Ottoman army is already in place, and then along comes the British army coming in a day late and a pound short with half their fleet sunk. A lot of these guys very sickly, and they immediately begin to set up tents and camp, and they build the latrine right next to the kitchen. This was a big mistake. Immediately you have an outbreak of cholera from a dead horse lying through a pipe that ran through the bottom of the kitchen, which ran past from the latrine through the kitchen, and everybody was just getting terribly sick. It was a horrible war for these guys. They fought a couple of battles, and then you have the arrival of Florence Nightingale to set up shop. Nobody ever heard of her at the time. She becomes basically the leader of the Red Cross, and sets up military cleaning, basically to cleanse the surgeon stations, to bring in a lot more in terms of, they don't have antibiotics, but they have anesthetics, to clean up everybody. Move the sewer system away from the kitchen, for God's sakes. And so even the Ottoman soldiers told them that. They said, you can't do that. You know, there's a good Muslim custom about separating the right hand from the left hand. Well, that's the kitchen and the latrine. You keep them apart. You don't have them together. I mean, if you want to die young, sure, go ahead. But anyway, so this thing gets going. The British forces run the wrong way on one battle. Charge of the Light Brigade, 1855. They take a charge and go up the wrong valley. The result is the Russians just blow them to smithereens. They leave with 600, they come back with about 30 left. They say, I think it's been a bad day. It's a good thing. And I could show a little bit of the movie on that. I've got the new one. It's new, it came out in 1967.
That's new.
The old one came out in 1932. That is old. That's older than I am. And that's hard to come by. Older than I am. All right. So this crazy war is going on. And eventually, by the winter of '55, you have elections in Britain, and Palmerston becomes prime minister. Now he's the prime minister. He says, this bullshit's going on too long. We've got to win this war. Let's win it now. And what he does is he now brings troops from the Raj, from British India, to fight in this war. They haven't been in the war yet. He brings 60 to 70,000 sepoys, Muslim, Hindus, Sikhs from India, fight in the British Army to go to the Crimea. But for a Hindu, crossing over all that water is a polluting act. It becomes a source of irritation. But they wind up going to the Crimea. But one thing, these guys do know how to fight. And they carry the day. At the end of the day, by 1856, they've overwhelmed. I mean, the Russians have terrible supply problems. And Tsar Nicholas I dies of pleurisy down at the front in the Crimea. So the Russians capitulate, back off. And it's a war that never should have happened. Nobody's happy with the results, but Palmerston wants to keep this war going, and nobody knows why. And the only reason that we understand why possibly he did, and why the British became so distrusted at the time, is because Palmerston had those secret documents from the Persian court showing that the Russians and the Persians were going to invade British India. And he fully believed it. 10 years later, another British diplomat in Tehran got a hold of those documents, the original documents, and he said, "I'm very sorry to tell you that the documents, as they were interpreted 10 years ago, were not interpreted correctly. It was the Persians who wanted to invade British India, not the Russians. And the Russians really had no part of this, they weren't gonna ever support it, but yet we fought the entire Crimean War over that." Now the problem is, this is not, you won't find this in a single textbook anywhere. So I'm telling you this because it does not occur anywhere. This was my own personal discovery at the British India office. I was working there for about a year, and I came across these documents, and I read a paper on this up at PSU a couple years ago. This thing. It still has not come out in print anywhere that I know of. Yes?
Why didn't the British bring when they found the first documents, the ones that they thought the Russians, why didn't they go to the concert of Europe and be like, hey, the Russians are thinking about invading our empire. If they do this, we...
Well, no, because nobody gave a crap about the British Empire outside of the British. You take it to the concert is not gonna step in. Everybody's jealous of the British and the British Empire, pretty much.
I mean, this is the era of secret treaties. So, like, nobody
Yeah.
knows really what's up.
Pretty much. You don't know until you walk into something and you realize, oh shit, I should have done that, because I got some real problems. Toward the end of that war, a secret agreement was made by the small Italian state of Piedmont. It's called Piedmont, Sardinia. It's in the north. That if we help you fight this war and join on the side of the French and the British, but especially on the side of the French and fight this war, will you help us achieve independence as a nation state after the war is over? Now you're asking, I don't want you to get lost here with this. But that was a secret agreement that was set up. Secret agreement, very big. And when this war was over, one of the first things that happened is the explosion of a unification movement of Italy, all the Italian states together, led by Piedmont, Sardinia, to be supported by 100,000 French troops. Why? Because they fought at the Crimean under secret agreement. So the Crimean War shows this huge east-west split. It's the Eastern question. Decade and a half later, they're at it again. The Russians again move into southeastern Europe, this time to support the Bulgarian Revolution against the Ottomans. And the Bulgarians revolted, and they had a big battle, and the Russians stepped in to help them. It's known as the Bulgarian massacres. It became heavy propaganda at the time. Save the Bulgarians, you know, the Ottomans were attacking them using their irregular troops, the militia, known as the Bashi Bazuki, killed thousands of Bulgarians. But the Bulgarians had killed thousands of Ottomans. So now you have this wacko thing. The Russians are involved. They're going to create, at the end of this thing, and I'll get your question in a second, at the end of the day, Russia will have won that war. They will have created an independent state of Bulgaria, like you need to know that, independent state of Bulgaria with an outlet on the Aegean side and an outlet in the Black Sea. What does that give you? It gives you your warm water port. You're located on the Black Sea and the Aegean, and Bulgaria is going to be a client state of Russia because we've saved you and we've created you. And in 1878, the whole thing is reversed. At British insistence, they meet in Berlin in 1878. The Tsar of Russia is called to meet in Berlin as well. And the chairman of the meeting is the new German Chancellor of the new United Germany, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck tells the Tsar of Russia, you need to back off. So by the Berlin Agreement of 1878, the Congress of Berlin, part of this extension, illusory extension of the concert of Europe, the Russians have to withdraw any alliance or any connections to Bulgaria, and Bulgaria is cut down to 1/4 the size, with only an outlet in the Black Sea, but no outlet in the Aegean. That means all the Russian efforts have fallen apart. Is this ever going to end? And the problem is, it doesn't end until World War I. World War I, the Allies will make a complete flip-flop on all of these diplomatic issues and support Russia to have access on the Black Sea and the warm water port, connection to the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, and also to take the city of Constantinople. Give it all to the Russians as long as they stay in the war and support the British and the French against the Germans and the Austrians. And they almost did. Yeah.
If
Wait a minute, I'm sorry, you had a question first.
Yeah, what was the date of the Bulgarian Revolution?
Bulgarian Revolution occurred 1875 to 1878. The first treaty that gave the Russians the access into the Black Sea and the Aegean was called the Treaty of San Stefano. Sanstefano. And that was reversed by the Congress of Berlin in 1878. I hope all this political diplomatic history isn't driving everybody nuts. Yes, no.
so,
You wouldn't tell me if you were. Yes.
wasn't Bismarck's one of his key political movements to keep Russia allied or at least neutral with the Germans, so that way they wouldn't face a two-front war?
Right.
Then why did he?
This is earlier. This is very early. This is before all that gets going. You're going to have all that stuff occur in the 1890s, early 90s. This is still just the 1870s that Bismarck's policies haven't been really formulated yet. They're going to come, but it's not happening yet. Yeah.
So when Bulgaria was cut down to a quarter of its former size, was the rest of that territory just given back to the Ottomans?
Yes. Ottomans got saved, and the British were all supportive of this, of course. They want to keep the Ottoman Empire intact. They don't want to have the Bulgaria sticking out there, and they don't want to have the Russians having a foothold in Bulgaria. It really is the 19th century Cold War, Russia versus Russian expansionism, as they theorize, versus the British Empire, British imperialism. But it almost leads to war a couple of times. In fact, it did lead to war. All right. Those are the two major international clashes: Crimean War and the Berlin Congress, that epitomize the Eastern question. The other issue is the unification movements, which come about at the same period of time. They overlap. In 1860, there was an attempt, after the Crimean War was over, to unify the Italian peninsula. And it starts with the, basically, a revolution in the city of Rome under a leader named Mazzini, M-A-Z-Z-I-N-I. And Mazzini believed in full unification with Rome having to be the capital. Why? Because the last time Italy had a capital, it was at Rome under the Roman Empire. No other city in Italy would ever serve as a capital. I mean, Florence might be a nice place, lots of good art, but it's not a capital of the Italian peninsula. Venice, economically thriving during the Middle Ages, but still does not have a reputation that Rome has to be the capital. So from 1860 to 1870, the French worked hand in glove with leaders of the Roman Revolution, Mazzini, and later Garibaldi, Napoleon III, and ultimately they were able to create a unified Italy. That's a big problem that was solved. You look at the map just a year after it was over with, and Rome's the capital, so they had to find a solution. Well, Rome is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. You can't, how can you leave it as the head of a secular capital, as well as the head of the Roman Catholic Church is not going to conflict. So they carved out a central part of the city of Rome, where St. Peter's Church is, and where you have the Roman Catholic Church having much of its sacred space and so forth. That became known as Vatican City. So Vatican City emerges as the specific and separate head of the Roman Catholic Church as a political organization, whereas the rest of the city of Rome emerges as the capital of unified Italy. So they try to solve that, this project, but it could have led to war had they not solved it peaceably. Probably the most violent upheaval comes with the unification of the German states. It starts in 1848. You had a student organization throughout Germany, the German states wanting to unify the country. It's very romantic in nature and so forth. And it's called the, well, I'll give you the name, but you don't get right there. The Burschenstocken. And it means the German Student Union. And you had, just put down German Student Union, okay. And this thing was constantly preaching unification of all the German states and so forth. And they figured what they needed, however, was one very strong German state with a good army to lead the unification movement, and they chose Prussia. And Prussia was the wrong state to choose at the time because the Prussians said, we don't want to do this because it's going to turn every other state in Europe against us if we do this. Because the rest of Europe was against the unification of Germany. Nobody wanted it. Guess who especially did not want it?
Austria.
French?
French. Right on the French border. So, result was, after many attempts to try and pull together a union, to make a long story short, the Prussians decided to lead the charge finally in 1870, and they did so with their chancellor, who was the unifier of Germany, and that's Otto von Bismarck. He was chancellor of Germany. Actually, he was foreign minister for Prussia. And the king of Germany was Wilhelm the First. But in order to achieve unification, they had to fight a war, and the war was with France. And they beat the French soundly in 1870, the War of 1870. The war lasted maybe 3 months. The French army totally collapsed. 200,000 troops surrendered. The King of France, or who was Napoleon III, was sent in exile. In jail first, then in exile. His son, the Prince Imperial, went into exile into England, where he joined the military and he was killed in the Zulu Wars, fighting imperial battles with the British. It's a very strange history, this period. And so ultimately, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 becomes the starting point for the First World War. Because the terms of the treaty that end that war between the French and the Prussians creates, number one, it creates modern Germany. Creates the German Empire. Shall I go on to the treaty conditions? First of all, the French have to give up 2 provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. They have to give up all the industrial areas on the Rhine Basin, Alsace-Lorraine, and then the Rhine Basin. The document has to be signed by the French government at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Are you kidding me? The sacred location of Louis XIV, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, it's the central location and mystique of French power, and that's where we have to sign to surrender to the Germans. It's done deliberately. So all that's done. And then you have to pay an indemnity of 50 million of what? It wasn't francs, but people say it's in francs, but it was in pounds. Or dollars, but anything but francs. Franc isn't worth shit. Okay, the French franc is never a high valued bit of currency even then. But it was a lot of money. And German troops will remain in the city of Paris until it's paid off. Which they did, they kept it, I mean, they absolutely humiliated the French in the worst possible way. When it was over, and the treaty is signed, and the French recovered from what happened to them, this develops with what we call the revenge mentality. We're gonna get even with those German bastards. So you have a cycle starting here between Germany, the newly born Germany, and France. France loses its emperor, it ceases to be an empire again, it now becomes the Third Republic. And humiliation is complete. And these two countries will begin the process of building arms, material, certain educational hatred throughout the school systems of both countries. They hate each other, but especially it's the hate of the French against the Germans. The Germans won this contest, they don't hate the French. They were just glad to have them there as a punching bag. But at this point, the French are absolutely, they're mortified. This is not the great empire of the old Napoleon. This is different. This is a total humiliation of French history. It's a total nullification of French history. It's a total nullification of French superiority. So, when it's over, it becomes the real big deal. Now, stop right here. The Brits are looking at all this, and the British government now, under Victoria, she became queen in 1837, 5 years after the Reform Bill of 1832. She's a young queen, she's only in her 20s when she comes to power, and she is going to marry a German, Prince Albert. They're madly in love. They have 9 children. And she becomes hugely respected in Britain. That's why it's called the Victorian Age. All the children marry into the royal families of Europe, which means that Victoria is going to become the grandmother of every major European monarch within 20 years of her coming to power. She's respected, and then in the 1860s, one of her prime ministers, whose name was Benjamin Disraeli, D-I-S-R-A-E-L-I. Benjamin Disraeli will emerge to support her not only as the Queen of England, but as the Empress of India. He wants to give her an imperial title. So if you see that big statue as you come into the Cerebral in downtown London, as you go over into, let's say, the Blackfriars area of London, across that bridge, there's a huge statue of Victoria there. And there's one near Hyde Park where you have the globe set up, and you have the globe divided into 4 parts. You have a lion on each side of the globe, a British lion, of course. And there it is on top. It's Queen Victoria, Imperatrix India, Empress of India. They loved it. The people loved it. This was Disraeli's idea. She's not just a queen; she is the mother of them all. She rules all the continents. 1/4 of the population of the globe, 1/4 of the territory of the globe, and they're going to maximize this into great propaganda. And it works. So the British are now, they're watching all these other things, these unification movements and all this. But slowly but surely what's going on is Britain represents the first generation technology in the Industrial Revolution. By 1870 and 1880, midway through Victoria's reign. The British industrial capacity begins to be passed by the new industrial capacity of the German state. Germany is passing her up. And Germany's industrial capacity is also sharpened, modified by something very important: new technology. The British are going to continue to use whatever has worked for the last 3 generations. As long as it's not broken, don't fix it. We're not going to change anything. We're not going to modify. We're not going to go into automation. We're going to keep every worker at his location. Why? Because we are proud to have all our people at work. The result is Britain is going to become, certainly technologically behind the production 8 ball by 1900. The other country that passes her up beside Germany is the United States. We have to go into automation because we don't have the population. Why is Britain so insistent on keeping everybody on the job? Because they have so damn many workers. And they're still operating under the fear that if they don't keep these workers working, you're going to have a revolution. They never had one. So they're trying to make sure they don't have one. So they begin to lose in the production arena. We'll come back to that. And then something happened in the 1880s. First of all, the British jumped. They've already got an empire. They know that. They said they didn't want one. We talked about that. But they wound up, after the Napoleonic Wars, they wound up with an empire twice as large, because they kept all the territory. They had a war against the Chinese, which they seized Hong Kong. So that now they have colonies all the way into the Pacific. Australia and New Zealand are settlement colonies that are growing like crazy. Those colonies are now turning into what they call dominion status, or developing responsible government. Responsible government means you are in charge of your own internal affairs. You have your own governors, you have your own parliaments. Responsible government. But it's still part of the empire.
Wasn't that something very similar to what they had done and realized their mistake with the 13 colonies?
No, they do it a little differently. They're going to be much more careful how they do this, and they're going to base it on a model with Canada. Canada's going to have responsible government. Australia will have it. New Zealand will have it. And then you have the territorial strategic colonies like Hong Kong, Singapore, big ones. India being the Raj. India's the center of everything. It's absolutely the center. It's the reason for the empire. Question?
Oh, like, at this point, they're like highly centralized, right? Like in Canada, all instead of the state, their senators are actually appointed by the Queen of England.
Yeah, there's pretty much. Each country has its own little take on it. They vary from country to country, but nonetheless, it's a going concern. Nobody is looking to break loose from the empire. People are still pretty proud at this time to be part of that empire, but the empire is now going to double again. And that's because Britain now becomes very interested in what's going on in the Middle East under the Ottoman Empire. Starting with 1840, Britain fought 3 wars that were successfully pursued by the foreign minister at that time, Lord Palmerston, who we've already mentioned in other contexts. It's Palmerston who urged the British of India to invade Afghanistan in 1840. Cost the lives of between 4,000 and 5,000 British troops who never came back alive. In the same year, Palmerston urged the British to invade south of the Red Sea at Aden. And they took Aden as their only actual colony that they ever had in the Middle East. It's a direct colonial rule, later called a, what's the word I want to use, crown colony. Strategic location, bottom of the Red Sea, entry into the Indian Ocean. It's right there today near Somalia, Arabian Peninsula, Yemen. It's a very strategic choke point. It's the only actual colony the British ever had in the Middle East. The rest of it they wanted to control through informal influence. And so, with that in mind, they also subjugated the country of Egypt, who was under control of its very independent ruler named Muhammad Ali. Now, Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1840, they went to war to push Muhammad Ali's army back into Egypt and to make sure Ali and Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire. So now the British are both directly and informally situated throughout between Afghanistan and the Middle East. Though they lost the Afghan campaign, lost 4,000 guys and simply never came back. The British invaded Afghanistan the next year just to burn down the marketplace at Kabul as an act of vengeance. You killed 4,000 of us last year, and we're back, and we're going to burn all your carrots. Whatever they, nuts. Just a total act of vengeance. Anyway, they're going to continue to maintain someone on the throne of Afghanistan like we do with Karzai, with money, pay him to stay there, pay him to be a puppet, sort of guarantee informal control. Okay. So now they're in Egypt as well. And in Egypt they begin to build railroads, they begin to have informal influence, and it looked like Egypt might go independent in 1880. They invaded Egypt the following year. So Egypt now becomes part of the direct control mechanism. It's an invasion that shouldn't have happened. It's an invasion that they deny they never did, really. And they will stay in Egypt for the next 72 years. But what does that do? My point was, once they take Egypt, everybody now feels free to build your empire, build your own empire. The British are doing it, and if we don't get out there, there won't be anything left. So what are we looking at? We're looking at this map. As the British began to build an obvious empire, again, here's Egypt. Along with Egypt comes the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Now this is simply today known as the Sudan. Who ever heard of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan? It sounds good. Well, what was it? British control of the Sudan based on the fact that Egypt had conquered the Sudan a generation earlier. So the British now seize that. But where is this all going? Because the British have what? A huge facility down south, South Africa, Cape Town. So what they plan to do in the 1880s, 70s, and 80s is build Cairo to Cape Town at railroad. The British are the masters of railroad imperialism. Look out when they start building tracks in your back frickin' yard, man. That means they're coming. They're coming without pit helmets. So they're going to build, and they're going to start working on this. They work on this for decades. They want to unify North and South Africa. They're going to claim East Africa, Kenya, Uganda. Well, once they do that, everybody jumps in. Look who jumps in. You see all the green, the really bad green? It's France. Here's the green here, little tiny France. Here's this vast territory. British said, let them come. They're going to have the desert. So it's all desert. They gave them Sahara. Wonderful, the French said. You haven't been there. You'll find out. They had a clash right here between the British and the French at Fashoda. The French had the claim, but the British had the military, so there was no contest. The Italians get on the act. They claim Libya. And they also claim the area to the east over here, Somalia, which used to be known as Italian Somaliland. Wait a minute, whoever heard of these places? Why are you going there? I don't know why we're going there, but everybody else is, and you can't leave us out. What's the smallest country in Europe? Can't find it on the map.
Michigan's not in there.
Just got created.
Belgium.
Belgium.
Belgium, it was just barely created, just barely by the 1832. Suddenly Belgium says, we want a piece of Africa. Look what they give them. This blue thing. That's the frickin' Belgian Congo, man. It's got more diamonds, more jewels, more raw resources, everything. And then come to, I mean, how do people that have barely been a country for 2 decades claim Central Africa, for God's sakes? But everybody's in here. And then the Germans, well, you got a German, and you got to go to, yeah. Here we have a real winner. It's called Namibia, German Southwest Africa. This is the worst place on the planet. Okay. German East Africa. Why? Because it separates the British. And they're going to do it right there. So everybody's now from this is chess. This is international chess game. Dividing people all up against their will. They don't want these Europeans here. Europeans are maintaining claims. They're maintaining military forces here, and all kinds of bullshit clashes go on here, especially between the French and the Germans, and the Italians and the British. Everybody is in the claim game. It's a total disaster. So this is the beginning of what we call the rush for Africa. 1882, when Egypt was taken, starts with Egypt, through 1910. It's the rush, it's the neo-imperial rush. Sounds like a fraternity. Rush. Okay. Creates a lot of tension. They spread to the Pacific. Everybody jumps in on this one. The Spanish were already in the Pacific with the Philippines. But right in the middle of this period, in 1898, the United States went to war with Spain in order to free Cuba from the Spanish. But that wasn't our purpose. Our real purpose was what? To seize the Philippines before somebody else did. So we have a Pacific Empire. So we seize the Philippines. The British are in Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. The French are in, the French do okay here. They're in Tahiti. This is not bad. One can live with this. Okay. The French in Tahiti, you've got everybody, and then you have the Germans in the Bismarck Archipelago. You ever wonder how that thing became known as the Bismarck Archipelago? Not that far from Gilbert Islands in the middle of the Pacific. Was Bismarck like there? No. This is named after him. This is German. So even Germany jumps into this whole race for colonies very late. The only country that's left out of the colonial jumping match in the Pacific was Japan. Japan was just coming into its own as a major industrial power. They're also going to emerge as a major nationalist imperial power under the military, under Tojo, the military general. That hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. And that's going to be the reason that Japan even jumps into World War I. Yeah.
France claim Vietnam at this point?
Yeah, they have Vietnam, they have Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They have all of it.
What would you say is the profitability of these colonies?
Not.
Just money holes?
Yeah, for the British, the original object was controlling the Suez Canal. Very strategic importance for them. As far as money is concerned, the British determined that north of Cape Town there was a lot of diamonds and gold being out there. That is basically the mineral wealth that was understood in the time. That was it. The other stuff never paid off. These were far more expensive to maintain than anything you ever got out of them, but it becomes a source of national pride that you've got to have this overseas imperial empire. Everybody's doing it. And if you don't do it, you're kind of a big loser. Bismarck, for instance, tried to prevent Germany, whom he had just unified, from ever doing this. It's a waste of money. And you build that empire, you're going to have a navy to protect it, you're going to be involved in all kinds of conflict. And he believed that he had gotten what he wanted after the Franco-Prussian War, so why get involved in any more of this stuff? And so he doesn't want to do it, but he can't resist the pressure. In the German Reichstag, many Germans said, no, we have to have an empire. We have pride, we have to have an empire. And they went in late to do it. And so, you know, when they used to sort of picture the Germans, they're going in late, knocking over everybody to get their empire, and, you know, looking like a bunch of nuns. That's the idea, that they can look bad. So it's a rather, you know, but basically, the British had the choices. They had the choices there, because they had India. India was just the source of everything, plus they had the gold in Central Africa that they were going to steal from the Dutch. Okay, anybody else? Questions?
Did Spain have any claim land in it before its partition?
No, Spain never really got involved with Africa at all, ever.
There was the slave trade.
Yeah, but that's Portuguese, the dealt with slave trade. That's all right. But I mean, the Spanish were divided from ever getting in there by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was, I think, signed in 1490. And it separated Spain and Portugal. They could divide the world between them. Nice. And so as Pope Adrian IV drew this thing up. And it gave everything to the east of a line in the Atlantic to Portugal, because Portugal had the overseas empire, the first line. And then you everything to the west of that line would belong to Spain, which included most of North and South America, most of it. Except the line went right through Latin America and gave the east portion of that to Brazil, Brazil to Portugal. So that there have been lines drawn before, but Spanish really never had much of anything going on in Africa.
What would you say is Spain right now? Like just really backwards, just kind of like just doing its own thing?
Pretty much. I mean, it's a very backward country. They never recovered from the Napoleonic War, and they're not going to have any attempt to modernize anything about it until, I mean, they lose their colonies to the United States in 1898. They're going to, not everything, but pretty much everything. And ultimately, they're going to have the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s in order to try to, they were trying to build a new Spain with elections under the president, maybe get rid of the king. There was all kinds of issues there, and then you know the fascists take over the country with Francisco Franco. So I went to Spain at that time. I remember talking to Franco. He's still alive. No, he was still alive then. I was there in the 70s, and Franco was still around. It was a very strange feeling country at the time. It just did not fit, didn't feel like part of Europe at all. And I think it's had a hard time trying. But these days, apparently, you know, they modernized a lot. And so there seems to be a lot more in terms of commercial development and university training, so forth, coming out of Spain than they've never really been part of the rest of Europe. They always seem like Spain sort of east of Poland somewhere. in terms of European culture, history, and so forth. I mean, Spain, you don't even talk about Spain after the death of Philip II, the great king of the 17th century. That's it. I mean, after Philip II, you can't even find Spain. You know, after the conquistadores and the conquest of the New World, it's very hard to find Spain. Well, Spain is sort of off the map here. Certainly in the 19th century, there's not much going on. But Britain, in the meanwhile, now has I'd say, a leg up on empire. They're at least still competitive in terms of the Industrial Revolution. They're in the process of changing the technology in terms of shipbuilding that's coming up. So we're going to stop right here and just take a look a minute at what we're doing. You have the overseas colonization, you have industrial competition, you have the Eastern question, you've got the British with a huge empire to protect, you've got a challenge now from other new empires as a result of what? keep in mind, the triggering mechanism for neo-imperialism for all of Europe is what? The British invasion of Egypt. It opened the doors so that everybody else decided they could have overseas colonies. Nobody else really, even though it didn't pay. But what it becomes is a sort of the ethos of national pride to have an overseas empire. And these little overseas empires can be very quickly have clashes with each other. French versus the British, French versus the German, German versus the Italian, all kinds of clashes that could ultimately spill back into Europe and generate a war. One thing is for certain, if Europe ever generates a war itself, you know that war is going to spread almost automatically internationally because they all have overseas colonies. So you can never contain a European war as a European war only. It's going to be a war that's going to generate a whole global ethos all its own. Yeah.
So could you say at this time that England was really the leader of Europe because whatever the English did, everybody else tried to copy them?
Kind of. I mean, I'd say in one sense, they are definitely ahead in terms of overseas colonization. They have the empire hands down. I mean, everybody else has empires, but they're nothing like what the British have. As far as their industrialization, it's slowly falling behind that of the more recently industrialized countries that are making stuff more of it and doing a better job of it. So you have that stiff competition. But Britain has the Navy. And so what I want to look at, just remaining a couple of seconds here, is just, you have the Navy, you've got overseas clashes, you've got all the ingredients for a real problem if you have crises that are going to lead to a real problem. There has been no war, no major war in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic period. Yes, you've had wars, but the Crimean War, just to review here, the Crimean War lasted 3 years, but it's in the middle of nowhere. Couldn't find it. The Franco-Prussian War lasted 3 months. French gave up. The Austro-Prussian War, which we did not discuss, was not worth discussing. Lasted about a month. So you had wars and you had revolutions, but none of it came close to the 5 global wars of the prior century, ending with the Napoleonic defeat of Napoleon. So Europeans generally felt that this was a pretty damn good era. You had longevity, life expectancy increasing, generally better food supplies. You had the worst abuses of the Industrial Revolution being somewhat overcome by unions, socialization, and even communism, Bolshevism. People trying to deal with those social ills. So you have a lot, then you have a pretty, since there had been no major war, nobody expected one, everybody is feeling pretty damn good about the future as we get into 1900. Queen Victoria is still alive. The Victorian age is a wonderful age. People are proud of their heritage. They don't have a psychology of war. There's an innocence about this period. People are generally content and positive. You don't get the cynicism, you don't get the kind of hardcore response to government that we do today. I mean, come on now, how many of us really trust the government anymore? Not really. I can't even trust the school government. But the people of that century were. We read their letters, they're so naive about things. They talk about the future as bright and rosy and everything is going upward and onward and upward. Why? Because of certain theories that went around, like what? Theories of social evolution. If real evolution occurs, as according to Darwin, then we have reason to believe that we can become better and better and better and better. There's no end to what we as, get this, white Europeans can achieve. This is called social Darwinism. If you accept Darwinism as a science, you accept social Darwinism as an outgrowth of science as social science. And then it's the white man's job to get out there and make sure everybody shares in this progress. This is the age of progress. It's called the age of the inevitability of progress. It's just going to get better and better and better. And boy, you read diaries and letters of the period about the turn of the century, before the Titanic went down. You read the stuff and you go, I can't believe people were this naive and accepted their government's viewpoint of things, just without question. The trust. All that trust is going to be destroyed in the trenches of the First World War. After 4 years of that nightmare, nobody believed anybody. But we're looking at an innocent age here. And it's an amazing period, so we're going to pick this up on, we'll pick it up on Monday, and then we'll show some movies. We'll start the war. The campaign will start the war.